there! Welcome to Gankey Productions. I'm Conor Gray's Cocon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're going to be continuing with our Disney series. In today's video we're looking at none other than Sleeping Beauty from 1959. So if you like what you've seen already, don't forget obviously hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and obviously hit the bell button so you stay notified of all upcoming videos. But as always when we're doing our videos, we have it split into 6 different sections. So you have section 1, which is the story of a story, section 2, which is the story of the creator, section 3, which is the story of the studio, section 4, which is the themes and history, section 5, which is the legacy, and section 6, which is any notable lines or notable effect within the film. So without further ado, we're going to dive straight now into the story of the story, so buckle up and let's go for the ride. So the 1959 film was actually based off a much earlier story by Charles Perrault. I'll probably pronounce his name wrong, so apologies, but he's the same person who wrote Cinderella. So we'll talk about him a little bit more later, but for now we're going to dive straight into the plot of Sleeping Beauty, which is a little bit different from his original. So the story starts off with the birth of Aurora. So she is the princess to King Stefan, and he hosts a big party for her, for everyone to celebrate. So some of the guests who are there include young Prince Philip. So he looks about 7 years old in this, but anyway, he's betrothed to this newborn baby girl. And there are 3 good fairies who come bringing gifts, and we have Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather. However, there's a bit of a party pooper, right? Because Maleficent, who is the 4th bad fairy, right? She doesn't get an invite, so she decides to crash the party. So rather than just doing the standard thing that people do when it comes to, not being invited to kids' birthday parties, instead of just drinking all the wine and then pissing on the carpet, instead what she does is she puts a curse on baby Aurora, right? Which is a little bit extreme, and also you will see it's a little bit random. Because what the curse is that on her 16th birthday, she's going to prick her finger on a spinning wheel and then she's going to die. So a little bit of an overreaction, but as she disappears, what Merryweather, the final fairy, does is she gives the gift in which basically cancels out some of the most extreme parts of this curse. So she's not able to completely undo the curse, but what she does do is have it so that Aurora will end up having an eternal sleep, which can only be broken by a kiss by her true love. So it's a little bit random this, because if you're able to make amendments, first of all, wouldn't you just have it so that she'd have a quick nap rather than just an eternal sleep? And also, why even have this stipulation in? It's very specific and it's a bit random, but anyway, that's how it is. So what Flora suggests is that the 3 fairies end up turning into peasant women, and they take Aurora into the forest to look after her and to raise her for the next 16 years. And they give her a fake name as well, so it's kind of like a witness protection program kind of thing. And what King Stefan does is that he burns all of the spinning wheels in all of the kingdom, which first of all would have been really detrimental to the economy of the kingdom, but also as well, it's also kind of unnecessary, because it's, you could just say on your 16th birthday, don't touch a spinning wheel. It's really that simple, right? But anyway, they go to the extreme lengths, and Maleficent for the next 16 years is completely incapable of being able to actually find her. And the reason for this is because her minions are really, really stupid, and that all this time they've been looking for a baby. So what she does is she sends her pet raven to go on the search for it, and basically says, do not fail. So we now skip to Briar Rose, right? So Briar Rose is the fake name for Aurora, and she has been told by the fairies, to go out looking for some berries. And while she's doing this, the fairies are going and they're making a dress for her, and they're making a birthday cake for her. So while this is going on, she's in the forest, she goes and sings, and while she's singing, this attracts the attention of Prince Philip, who happens to be riding through. And so Prince Philip goes on a search for this singing voice, and also with the help of some critters, he ends up coming across Aurora, and this is where there's the very beautiful song of Once Upon a Dream, which is the theme of the actual film. But she runs off because she's been told by them not to speak to strangers. So back at the cottage now, the fairies, they kind of given up, because the cake is terrible and the dress looks terrible. So they finally start using magic. However, they get a bit carried away and end up fighting over the colour of the dress, and this ends up alerting the Raven. And then when Aurora comes back, they finally tell her the truth of she's the princess and this and that, etc., etc. And so they basically end up unintentionally snitching to the Raven, who then flies off back to Maleficent. So when Aurora comes back and she tells the fairies that she met someone in the forest, they kind of break it to her and kind of say, oh, well, you're already betrothed to Prince Philip, to which that she becomes very distraught and ends up crying. And then similarly, when Prince Philip goes back to King Hubert, who's his father, and tells him that he met someone in the forest, he breaks the news to her that actually you can't because you're already betrothed to Princess Aurora. So he storms off and he goes back to the cottage, to try and find this peasant girl. So the fairies sneak Aurora back into the castle. However, what ends up happening is Maleficent comes there and she ends up hypnotizing Aurora. So Aurora ends up being taken up into the attic, and this is where she pricks her finger on the spinning wheel and she goes into a deep, everlasting sleep. So what the fairies do is they send the entire kingdom to sleep. Again, this doesn't really make much sense because, what if there's wolves about, like kind of they might end up just eating these people who are just like asleep and stuff. But anyway, we'll put part of that for now. But while they're going to sleep, right, King Hubert mumbles to one of the fairies, that Prince Philip has met someone in the forest. And at this point, the fairies realise that the person that Aurora met in the forest is Prince Philip. So they go back to the cottage to try and save him. However, he gets kidnapped by Maleficent and taken back to a dungeon in the Forbidden Mountain. So the fairies go off to rescue him, but before they rescue him, Maleficent does the classic thing that a lot of villains do, where they tell all of the plans to the person, right? Rather than just killing them or rather than just whatever, right? They tell all the plans, so now he's fully aware of what the setup is. So the fairies come in, they rescue him, and they also give him a sword, and they also give him a shield as well. And basically he ends up escaping with the help of these fairies, and Maleficent gets really, really annoyed and turns into a dragon, right? Fire-breathing dragon. So he ends up having to fight her, and then with the help of the fairies, the sword goes straight into Maleficent's heart. She ends up dying, and then he's able to go and give this unconsensual kiss, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So Aurora wakes up, the whole kingdom wakes up, and everyone lives happily ever after. So that's the story of the story, and now we're going to dive into the story of the creative process that went into the making of this film. So like we said, Charles Boulleau, he's the one who wrote this back in 1697. However, we have covered him a lot more in the Cinderella video, so definitely go and check that out for a bit more like in-depth thing with him. But also the story of Sleeping Beauty, much like with Cinderella, all these stories are based off of much like older text, right? So if you go all the way back to 1330 to 1344, you have the story of Perceforest, and this was what it was originally based off, right? So it's linked with the stories of King Arthur, so this story originally comes from England. Then in 1634, you have an Italian version of it, which is called Pentamerone, right? And again, it's a very similar kind of thing. And also the Brothers Grimm, they also had a version of the story themselves. However, our story with this with regard to Disney comes in 1938. So this is when Disney decided to make the story, and he got Joe Grant to write a script for it. However, work on the project got paused until 1950, and the reason for this is because Walt Disney wanted the technology to get much better, and he wanted for this to be his masterpiece, right? So the stakes were really, really high for this film, to give you an idea. However, the big fear for this was that it was going to be too similar to Snow White and also to Cinderella, right? And so there were many changes that were made to it to make it a little bit more different. So the first major change was that Philip was going to be given a much bigger role than any other of the kind of like hero princes had been in other things. And also it was decided that Aurora wouldn't be aware of her status. So whereas Snow White, for instance, knows that she's a princess, Aurora wouldn't know her status. And Aurora, unlike many other Disney princesses, right, it decided that she would have a fresh and modern sensibility in order to appeal to contemporary audiences. So whereas a lot of the other princesses have been quite like, old-fashioned, she would have a lot more kind of pizzazz to her, right? And you can really see this with her character. Another big change was that instead of there being 8 fairies, they end up whittling it down to 4. And this process was done around 1951, right? So they had most of the script kind of ironed out by then. And also they decided that Maleficent was going to be a lot more of a menacing character, right? So rather than her having this kind of like hag-like appearance that was in like the original, instead it was decided she'd be a lot more of a menacing character. Also as well, they decided to cut out the kind of bizarre like second half of the original story. So in that original, there's a thing where the princess ends up marrying a strange prince, and it kind of, the story doesn't really go anywhere with that. So they decided instead, to just have it much neater and just have it in like pretty much focused on the first half of it. And the writers that they had for this story were Ted Sears, Bill Peet, Winston Hibler, and Ralph Wright. Also as well, another change that was made was that the good fairies, instead of them being very, very comical, so much like how the dwarfs are in Snow White, instead what was decided was that they would only have like a little bit of comical scenes, right? So a lot of the slapstick scenes were cut out. So the only ones that were left in was the one to do with the dress and the cake, right? So that was another thing that was kind of cut. Also as well, the Raven was originally going to be a comical vulture. Then they decided instead that it was going to become a sinister, huge falcon. But eventually they decided to keep it very simple and just have it as a raven. Another change that was made was also about how Aurora and Philip would end up meeting. So originally they were going to have this really convoluted story about like, there's a treasure hunt and they end up meeting each other there. But again, they decided to keep it very simple where they just happened to meet in the forest. And so as a result of this, the Once Upon a Dream scene almost never took place. Also as well, another change that was made was that instead of like how in Snow White, she's tricked by the witch, instead it was decided by Disney himself that Maleficent was going to hypnotize Aurora, right? Because this would, in the eyes of Walt Disney, make it an eerie, haunting presentation of a victim powerless in the hands of evil. And so this was another thing which was added in. Also as well, another thing, they didn't want to have many ideas from Snow White and from Cinderella because again, they want to keep it very separate. However, for a lot of things, right, a lot of the ideas that were discarded from Snow White and Cinderella, they were put into this. So for instance, Prince Philip escaping from the dungeon and like going off to rescue and stuff, right? That idea was taken originally from Snow White. And the thing of them dancing on clouds, right, at the end of the story, that was an idea which was taken from Cinderella. And then finally, the final thing is that the Once Upon a Dream sequence, right? That almost didn't happen because Disney kept holding it up. So much so, that the original director of this, he ended up actually having a heart attack. So the original director was Wilfred Jackson, and he ended up being replaced by Eric Larson. So that basically summarizes the story of the creative process that went into the making of Sleeping Beauty. But now we're going to talk about the story of the studio. So the film was originally going to be released on Christmas 1955. However, it ended up being delayed, like we said, by Disney. And a large part of this was because he was distracted because this was the time when he was setting up Disneyland. So the film ended up being postponed until Christmas 1958. Also as well, something to note is that many of the sketches, which were done for Forbidden Mountain, right? They come directly out of Fantasia's A Night on Bald Mountain, right? So a lot of the sequences there, you can see that the clear similarities between that. And that was obviously very much inspired by that. Also as well, the score for the film was based off of Tchaikovsky's Sleeping Beauty. So this is where the music is sampled from. And this was Disney himself who suggested this idea, which meant that all the work that Jack Lawrence and Sammy Fain had put into it, right, was completely thrown out. And the only thing that was left were the lyrics to the Once Upon a Dream song. Now talking about the animation. So just like in all other Disney films, you had a live action kind of like models for the characters. However, Milt Cole, he was really opposed to using the voice actors as the models for this, right? Because he said that what it did is it stifled creative effort. So this is the reason, so many people in the comment section for previous videos have asked why Hans Conried, for instance, is the model for King Stefan, but isn't actually the voice of him. And what you'll find with this film is that the only person who's actually, the characters based off of the actual voice actor, right, is that of Maleficent, right? And so that's the reason why everyone is all different. So with that being said, we're going to talk about the casting, right? So the person playing Aurora is Mary Costa, and she was actually a really famous singer. So much so that Jackie Kennedy actually asked for her to play at JFK's funeral service. And also she was appeared in a few other minor films. But she was one of 3 actresses who actually end up suing Disney later in life for the royalties for their voice. The other being Peggy Lee, who we mentioned in the last video with regard to A Lady and the Tramp, and also Eileen Woods, who appears in Cinderella. Then also in terms of Prince Philip, so he is voiced by Bill Shirley. So if you ever watch My Fair Lady, right, Freddie's character in that way sings the song On the Street Where You Live. If you ever heard that voice before, that's the same person, right? So Bill Shirley, his voice was dubbed over that, and he is the voice actor for Philip in this. Eleanor Audley is the voice of Maleficent, and like we said, she is the only person who actually was used for the model for their character. So she appears, like we said before, in Cinderella. So she is the evil stepmother, and that's why she was kind of like picked for this role. And also as well, you had another Disney legend, and this was Verna Felton. So she is the voice of Flora. You have Barbara Jo Allen, and she is the voice of Fauna. And she also has a minor role in A Sword in the Stone. And also you had another Disney legend who was Barbara Luddy, right? So she is the voice of Lady in Lady and the Tramp. That's the previous video, go check that out. And she also appears in 101 Dalmatians. Then also for King Stefan, so he's voiced by Taylor Holmes, and he actually died a little bit after like the actual release of this film. And then finally you have Bill Thompson, right? So we've mentioned him in many other videos as well, Alice in Wonderland, etc., etc. And he is the voice of King Hubert. So with that being said, that kind of covers the story of the studio. So now we're going to talk about the themes and the history of Sleeping Beauty. So, you know, the themes of this are very similar to many other things, but the ones that kind of stand out is, first of all, chivalry. You also have romance, you have jealousy, and also something which is really emphasized in this film is the use of magic, right? So whereas in other Disney films before this point, you had magic being a part of it, right? In this, it has a really major role, and actually the fact that the fairies aren't allowed to use magic for a big part of the film is really, really stressed by them, right? So really, really makes it a magical film. And also as well, something which we have to talk about, and this kind of ties in a little bit with the legacy of it, is, like we said before, the unconsensual kiss. So in recent years, people tried to cancel Sleeping Beauty. They tried to be like, oh, you know, it wasn't consent, etc., etc. First of all, I hear what you're saying, but at the same time, I don't hear what you're saying, because first of all, it is just a kiss. It's nothing more than that, right? So like, you know, this hold our horses, right? But also as well, within the film, A, they love each other, and B, if he doesn't do that, then the whole kingdom ends up being, you know, in eternal sleep, right? So it's kind of, you know, weighs up the pros and cons of it. Let me know in the comment section what you think about it. But in my eyes, it's like, it's not that deep, right? I'll probably get cancelled myself for saying that, but I think it's not that deep. But anyway, that being said, that controversy out of the way, we're going to now talk about the legacy of the film. So critics of the film gave it good reviews, but also said that it wasn't that great, right? Now, the reason being is because they said it was too similar to Snow White and Cinderella. So as much as Walt Disney tried to make it so it wasn't, the problem was that it just had too many parallels. And where it differed, it actually was worse. So for instance, you know, the fairies were nowhere near as funny as the dwarfs in Snow White. So that kind of was lost. And also as well, they made it much more of a kind of like monster movie kind of theme, right? Which is very reminiscent of kind of the films that they had in the 1950s. So it's very intense, right? It's very scary at points with Maleficent and stuff. And also like with the whole like dragon fighting scene, you know, it's very scary, but it's not on the same level as Snow White, right? So I think that Disney failed in making this a kind of legendary film, right? And also the box office kind of speaks for this as well. So at the time, this was the most expensive Disney film which ever came out, and it cost $6 million to make. But at the box office, it only made $3.8 million, right? However, the thing to kind of bear in mind with this is that, you know, it was a bit of a slow burner, right? Because over time, right, in terms of the lifetime gross of the film, in the US and Canada alone, it made $51.6 million. And actually, when you add it up in terms of its international audience, yeah, throughout its whole lifetime, when you adjust for inflation, it made $681 million, which makes it actually the second highest grossing film from 1959, second only to Ben-Hur, right, which obviously was a huge box office success. So I think a big part of the cost for this was the fact that this was the very first film which was filmed in, I'm going to have to read this because it's very technical kind of jargon, right? So it was Super Technorama 70 widescreen. So as I said with the last film where we talked about Lady and the Tramp, in the 50s and 60s, people like to experiment with different things with regard to widescreen. So this was the very first film which was done with Super Technorama 70, whatever, right? So they had this from 1959 to 1967. The very last film which was used this technique was Custer of the West, right, from 1967. So just a little bit of trivia with regard to this, and maybe this explains some of the ballooning costs of the actual thing, right? Because it's almost twice the budget that you had for the previous last three films, yeah, of Walt Disney. So this kind of covers the legacy of the film, and now talking about the notable lines and notable effects. In terms of the notable effects, there's nothing really that that stands out that much. There's a few things like in terms of like the background in some of the forest scenes. There's a lot of detail with regard to this, but even this caused quite a lot of a clash between two of the leading animators, right? So you had Jerry Geronimi, and I think I might have mispronounced the name, and then also Irvind Earl, right? Again, I'm probably mispronounced their name as well, right? But the two of them end up clashing. So Earl was the one who did the background, and Geronimini, he was basically saying, look, it looks really great, yeah, well done. However, it looks a bit too much like the Christmas cards, and also it's kind of come at the expense of the animation. So you can kind of see that within this, like the actual quality of the animation isn't like that good when it comes to the characters, but the background does look quite stimulating, although at certain points the background and everything doesn't look that great. And actually quite a lot of the influence for this came from the Museum of Modern Art in New York, as well as French Renaissance paintings and Persian and Japanese prints, right? So you can kind of see all these kind of influences going into the kind of creative process of this. So that kind of covers the kind of notable effects. And then in terms of notable lines, again, there's not really that many notable lines, but we'll have this.
I'd like to turn her into a fat old hot tub.
Now, dear, that isn't a very nice thing to say.
Well, that would make me happy.
And also this.
Houses and let me see, and all the cradles.
Balls! Idiots! Imbeciles!
And also this.
It looks awful.
It's because it's on you, dear.
But as you can see, like, they're kind of funny. They're not as great as the previous films, and it's a good film. It's highly recommend watching it and stuff. Like, it's very enjoyable, and also as well the final scene just anything to do with the music in it. I think the music in it really makes it, right. In particular, the Once Upon a Dream song, right. Both the first part of it being sung, and also as well when it comes to the ending, right. It's really magical, and yeah, so. That's my take on Sleeping Beauty from 1959. If at any point I've mixed up Sleeping Beauty and Snow White and Cinderella, that's because they are very similar, but still, it's not bad to be compared to those two classics. So that being said, we're now going to end this video, but also stay tuned for the next one, which is going to be 101 Dalmatians from 1961. So if you like this video, don't forget obviously hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell button so you stay notified of all upcoming videos. We're not going anywhere. We're going to do all the different Disney films, and then we're going to keep going on with the Kubrick films and with Chaplin films, etc, etc. So this channel, really share this with people, get subscribed if you haven't already, and in the meantime, have a great day and bye.